The following podcast contains frank discussions surrounding PTSD and police trauma, which some listeners may find distressing. If you are affected by the content, you can contact the Samaritans on 116 123. You're listening to a podcast from DCT Audio. I'm Dave Thomas, and I've been producing audio content for over 10 years. Thank you for listening to this edition of the programme. I do hope you enjoy it. My guest today was a career police officer who entered into the world of undercover operations. That work took its toll on his well-being, causing his mental health to slowly unravel. But it was also his experiences as a uniform response officer that ultimately contributed to his PTSD diagnosis. In a frank and graphic conversation, he describes those experiences and how it affected him and his family. I'm delighted to be joined today by a former police officer who is going to remain anonymous, and it'll become very clear very quickly why that is. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for inviting me.
Everybody has their own reasons, I suppose, for wanting to become a police officer. What prompted you to join up?
So I didn't grow up wanting to be a police officer. Grew up in a council estate. Once I left school at 16 on the Friday, I started with my dad as a builder on the Monday. Served my time as a bricklayer, did a little stint over in Germany, and then came home, did a couple of years out over there, came home, and I had my firstborn. The building industry was struggling at the time. There wasn't a lot of work about, and I needed some stability, really, so some regular income. And I just happened to be walking through the local shopping centre, and there was an advertisement there, come join the police. So I didn't tell anyone. I did everything sort of on the QT and went through each stage, and then I got offered a place, much to the amazement of most of my friends and family members.
What was you kept it quiet? What was their reaction when you told them?
Do you know what? Most people were really chuffed. There was a few people that I think they thought I was going to turn into some sort of supergrass or something like that. But the majority of the people were made up, and later on in years, I inspired a few others to join up as well.
Oh, good for you. I mean, it's the sort of thing that can split friendships, isn't it? I found that when I joined, most, as you say, most majority of people said, "Oh, well done, Dave," but there was one or two that kind of drifted away. And I suppose that's just life sorting your friends out for you, really.
Yeah,
isn't it?
yeah. I always had I've got a moral compass, so even growing up, I knocked about with lads that might have got in trouble, but I always knew right from wrong. So I don't think it was a shock to people. It was probably my way out of that sort of, that living that life as well.
Well, like all of us, when we joined, we spent a few years, I suppose, in uniform on the street, getting working knowledge, experience. So what attracted you to the undercover work in the police? And obviously this is why you're having to remain anonymous. So
I did 4.5 years in uniform, and I'll go back to that when it starts later when we start discussing the PTSD. But I went into plain clothes covert world, shall I say, quite early on in my career, and I joined the dedicated surveillance unit. So it was not long after the 7/7 attacks in London that funds became available for people to expand their capabilities for terrorism jobs and surveillance, etc. So I got an opportunity earlier than expected. It was something I always had my eye on, but the opportunity came a bit sooner than expected. So I put myself forward initially for surveillance. So once I was on the dedicated surveillance team, we would work on undercover operations as a support team, a wraparound for the UCs. I'd done that for quite a few years. I'd seen how it works. got to learn a lot from colleagues that had done it themselves, and I was always sort of, I never thought I had the look, shall we say, but everyone else did, and certainly the bosses in the covert side they'd come to me quite often, do you fancy a go? Do you fancy a go? So I'd done quite a few years surveillance as well, and I was probably ready for a change. So it was something that I could dip into and come back to my day job. So yeah, put myself forward and off I went. The worst course that you can imagine. It was they want to see how you are under pressure, and they put you under pressure. But I enjoyed it once it was finished, and that was it. Yeah, that started my journey.
I know a little bit about undercover work, but people who will be listening to this podcast won't have a clue. Is there one thing about undercover work that would surprise people about the role that you did?
Yeah, I think it would surprise, a lot of it would surprise people. I think there's been a lot of bad press around undercover work. Officers down south that have fathered children, etc., that created an inquiry, which I believe is still ongoing. And it's not, it isn't that. You haven't got a free rein. You've got your rules that you have to stick by. You're still a police officer. It's a tactic that I think is got overused quite a lot. Whether it's going to carry on in the future, I don't know. I personally think there is a need for undercover policing in the right circumstances, but you're still a police officer. You don't just go off and do your own thing, and you're not lawless. You're monitored. Finances have to be right. Everything, paperwork has to be right. Because at the end of the day, you can end up in Crown Court or somewhere like that.
I should imagine though that it is difficult though. I'm taking this view probably from what I've seen on the telly, even though I used to be a cop. If you're on a job for a long time, and although you've mentioned you're still a police officer and all the checks, it must be difficult sometimes to know which way is up.
Yeah, you are living it 24 hours a day, so you might get some time off for the weekend, and you might be with your family, but the phone's still ringing, and you're still trying to betray that person. You're still trying to. It's constant. Even if you might have a bit of time off to go on holiday, it doesn't leave you until that job is index. It's there all the time. Every time the phone rings, that starts the heartbeat.
It's the way you're describing it is very much to me like being at war.
Yeah.
And unless you're back at port, yes, you're at a state of war.
That's correct. Yeah, hyper alert. Everything. You have to think about everything you say. You get put on the spot quite a lot. You've got to be a quick thinker. You've got to and the biggest thing that I had going for me was my legend, which is obviously your backstory, was always believable and always sort of ran parallel to my life prior to the job. And I wouldn't tell someone I was a hairdresser, because what are they going to do? They're going to ask you for
a haircut.
They're going to ask you for a short back and sides.
Now, you mentioned PTSD, and that really is the sort of thrust and focus of this podcast. And at some point, your mental health did start to unravel. Was it one particular job or a culmination of things?
At the start, it wasn't very clear. We used to work long shifts on the surveillance unit, and I'd been working out of force, 16-hour shift, and I was driving back to the office, about an hour and 20-minute drive, and I'd started to become hyper alert, which I was anyway, because that was part of my role on the surveillance. You're always watching, you're always looking who's behind you. Have I been seen? Your exposure clock, etc. But my mind started to wander and race, and I drove back from that operation that day, and I got back to the office, and I couldn't remember the journey that I'd just driven. And I went in to see the sergeant, and I said, I don't know what's going on. I says, but I can't stop my mind racing, and I don't feel safe driving at the moment, so I need some time off. And that was the start of it, really. Looking back, the symptoms had been there for a long time. I was self-medicating with alcohol. I was, for about 12 months prior to me going off sick, I was exhausted constantly. And I think that was mentally exhausted. So I remember speaking to my wife, saying, I don't know what's going on, but I can't stop my mind racing. I'm hyper alert constantly. I've got nausea, got chest pains. This was anxiety symptoms. So booked off sick, went to the GP, medication. That's the first thing they do, is they try to get you on some sort of medication. And then it just unravelled from there. You know, things progressively got worse. I was referred to occupational health, spoke to a counsellor. They give you 6 sessions initially, and then they sent me for a RAPS assessment, which is a sort of, we need this person looking at quickly. So they sent me to speak with a psychiatrist, and that was when the first time PTSD was mentioned. The symptoms were very similar to PTSD, and I was, I can't have PTSD. I've not been to Afghan. I've not been to, I've not been to Iraq. I'm just a police officer sort of thing. And from there, I was given more therapy. I had EMDR therapy. I had 40 sessions of EMDR. This again was at the through the occupational health. The problem with that was it was based at the headquarters where I worked, so I had to go once a week for therapy, and that used to cause me a lot of anxiety because I didn't want to bump into colleagues, because it was trying to explain what's going on when I didn't really know myself at the time what was going on. So that was difficult. I think I knew I was done at that point. I think I've heard. I think it was yourself that said, you can't get better in the place that's made you poorly. So it was a long road. I was sent to the Priory to see another psychiatrist, and this is when I started to get the diagnosis for PTSD, general anxiety disorder, agoraphobia, and later on depression. So it was all sort of new. I didn't know what was going on.
And none of these things you'd suffered previously?
No, not at all, no. I am a type 1 diabetic, so that came later on in my police career, which again, that has, causes other issues that we could talk about. But so it was coming up to the six month mark, half pay, that sort, then that causes its own anxiety and stresses. Yeah. You've got mortgage to pay. By this point, I'm 6 months down medication. Initially it was sertraline, and that didn't seem to be working. So then they added some pregabalin, and then it was fluoxetine. And the problem with the medication was it takes so long for them to get you to the dosage that they believe that you need. If at that point the psychiatrist decide, well, that's not working, you have to wean yourself off them. So that's another 6 months, so it was like 6 month blocks of still not getting this medication right. Symptoms were probably getting worse, still having therapy, and it didn't really get any better. The problem with the therapy was, because I couldn't really pinpoint one incident, it was difficult for what they were going to work on, and certainly the EMDR therapy it's like black magic. It's amazing.
I have a friend who was the night detective, and he had to deal with the death of a 7-year-old boy, and he did the eye therapy, and he said it was exhausting.
Oh yeah, so the every week after a therapy session, I would just literally get home straight. It's the only way I could stop my mind sort of racing constantly, was to sleep. It was the only way I could get a reset. And by even the drive there, and the hypo alert levels were through the roof. I'd drive different routes. I'd stop because I wouldn't be happy with a car behind me, and this was constant. And I think it's like an adrenaline release, and that becomes really tiring. So, yeah, that was tough. But it was through the therapy that we started to try and pinpoint what was the cause, and it's very complex. My PTSD, most people, think it's down to the undercover work that I've done. It goes back a lot further than that. Uniform days. So, probably 4 years in the job, 3.5, 4 years in the job, and in the space of 5, 6 months, there was 6 incidents that they sort of worked on. Just uniform stuff. One of them was a sudden death, a young lad who'd hung himself, and I didn't realise until I arrived at the address that he was actually my cousin's son. I knew she lived in the area, and as I pulled up, and I could just see her, she was hysterical. So I had to deal with that. I cut him down. That was tough, but as a new police officer, you just think, well, this is it. This is what police officers do. On to the next job, from that next job on the radio. And it was always sort of Sundays that it happened. Next one was a guy who was going through some mental health problems himself, and his wife had decided that she wanted to separate. And I'd got to know the family quite well. I used to go around and I'd remove him from the address. And this was a nice family, I think he was a teacher, she was a solicitor, something like that. But he couldn't cope with the breakdown. And one Sunday morning, in front of his 2 children, he decided to tip petrol on himself and light put himself on fire. So that was, I'd just been to the address and took him to his mum's, and then I got a shout to go back because he was back at the address, and as I pulled into the cul-de-sac, he was on fire. So that was another job. 2 weeks later, Sunday morning, concerns for a young lady, 26-year-old lady. Boyfriend couldn't contact her, so we arrived, and I looked through the letterbox and I could see someone hanging in the stairwell, and we put the door in. She'd hung herself from the bed with the bedclothes, and a 4-year-old daughter was sat on the bottom of the step crying. That wasn't a nice job. And then a couple of weeks after that, we were behind a guy who was stabbing his partner whilst driving. 39 times he murdered his partner. So I don't want to go I'll be here all day talking about these jobs. Then the final one was, and I think this is the incident that caused most of my problems, was another Sunday morning, domestic, not far from the Nick. Turned out, gets a nice house, 1950s semi, with steps leading up to the front door. So as I pulls in, I'm first there, shouts up on the radio that I've arrived, and Mum and Dad are in the street, and Dad comes over, he says, I said, what's going on? Oh, it's my son. He's lost it. He's on steroids, blah, 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 blah. He said, don't go in there on your own. He said, so shouts up, where's me back up? Well, 5 minutes away, 10 minutes away, whatever it was. So I'm a talker, I'm good, it's something that I was always good at diffusing situations. So goes up to the front door, gets the captain out, and as I try to open the front door, there's like a bureau that's been pushed over, and I can see a really nice house, but everything's been trashed. So I stands at the pushes the door open, and I shouts, hello, anyone there? And I hears, who's that? I said, it's the police, come and have a chat. And this guy just comes running out the kitchen. He got the biggest knife he could get from the kitchen block, the knife block, sorry. Bare-chested, big lad, and he just went for me. So I tried to back out of the door, but there was about 4 steps down onto the driveway, and I tripped and fell, dropped my captor, landed on my back, and he came straight out the front door with the knife, bare-chested, straight on top of me. And it was one of those sort of who's the strongest moments. It seemed like it was minutes, but it was probably seconds. But he was trying to put the knife into my face. Managed to, what they teach you, what they teach you in self-defense, roll them off, whatever. And I got to my feet and I backed away. He ran off, popped the knife down a manhole, which the dog found later on. Initially, he was arrested for attempted murder, and it's like it ended up being a public order offence. And at the time, it didn't really affect me. I know 6 months later, he chopped someone's hand off with a samurai sword. So I think that sort of gave me the realisation that, yeah, he would have done it. He would have done it. So going back to therapy, I think that was a time in my life where I thought I was going to die. It was that sort of, this could be the end. But again, it was, well, that afternoon I was back out, dealing with shoplifters or, sudden deaths or whatever.
I think what you've just done in the last couple of minutes, and I've never heard it put so eloquently, is just describe the experiences of a police officer, which few people will ever comprehend, and the amount of trauma that we experience. And one thing that's going through my mind while I was listening to you and I was getting annoyed was the fact that, was there any support from the organisation?
Yeah, certainly. The guy, going back to the guy, his wife had left him. He was from Yorkshire, and she was in a women's refuge, and he'd paid someone to find out where she was, and he drove from Yorkshire to the location, and he waited for her. And as she came out of the refuge, he cut her throat, jumped out of the car, cut her throat, and he dragged her into the car, and he just continued to stab her. We weren't far away. We got behind the vehicle, but we were moving on to another force area. So we wanted to stop it, and we were told we weren't allowed to stop it because we were moving on to another force area and their pursuit policy was different, etc. Eventually, the vehicle was stopped. There was some off-duty doctors, student doctors, I think they were local, that were walking in the area where the vehicle was stopped, and they got the body out, and they said she gave her last breath. I beg to differ, but that was classed as a death in police custody because we were following the vehicle. It was, so all the vehicles were seized, statements, they were talking about taking out, and it was just like, what's going on here? So we ended up, we had to go be interviewed about what we'd done, etc. But the point I'm trying to get was, the only support we had was the inspector sat us down the following day. He went, everyone all right? Wasn't a great day yesterday, was it? Everyone all right? So, no, support-wise, it wasn't. And like I say, it was just, you new police officer, you think, well, this is it. This is the role. This is what we do. It's like a paramedic, isn't it? They're constantly dealing with the same thing. And I think what happens is you normalise the unnormal.
I was going to say, that's exactly what I was about to say. As you say, a police officer is expected. And the way to cope with it is to say, this is normal. And it's not. No. It's far from normal. And that's where that conflict starts inside you, doesn't it? And that's when problems start to...
Yes. Yeah,
to occur.
And obviously, them problems were starting. It was funny because it was after I left uniform that I was diagnosed with diabetes, type 1 diabetes, and there is some study in America to say that trauma can bring on type 1 diabetes, and I'll never know. I always think, was that the time?
Well, I'm type 2 diabetes, and I am pretty sure that part of the reason, not wholly, but obviously raised stress, cortisol in the blood, affects your blood sugar.
Yeah.
The
way the body deals with stress.
I'm on the same page with you. On that
like I say, I'll never have the answer to that question, but it does make me think, was that was that the thing that triggered or started that process.
So going back to your therapy, I apologise if it's an obvious question, but did it help you?
By the time I retired, I'd had 3 different therapists. I had a psychotherapist online, again, more EMDR. I think the therapy taught me, put the tools in the toolbox to deal with certain situations, but I also think it opened a lot of boxes, and it didn't, and we never closed them, because it took so long, I think, to pinpoint the cause or the causes of my PTSD. I think if we'd have known at the start, this is what we need to work on. But everyone presumed it was the undercover stuff. Yes, the undercover stuff was probably what broke the camel's back at the end. We also had COVID as well during that time, and being a diabetic during COVID, I was told, don't leave the house, because if you get it, you're going to die. It was so that experience for them 2 years of trying to homeschool kids and still go to work, and that was another stress, another thing. I think that they talk about the glass, and I think it was just things were just topping it up, and eventually my wife calls it my tuna meltdown. She says, I think it just got to the point where I couldn't cope with any more, and yeah, I'm a different person today for it.
The reason I asked you that obvious question rather clumsily is that there is a danger, isn't there, that, as you say, with the police, you get so many counselling sessions, can actually take you to a place, quite a bad place, and then it stops, and you're actually in a worse place than when you were when you started the therapy.
Yeah. So quite a significant moment for me, and it's a day I always think about, was I wasn't in a good place. I was sat on the bathroom floor, and I wanted it to stop. I wanted everything to stop. I was suicidal, diabetic. I had the answer. I could empty a pen of insulin, and it was all. And I can remember saying to my wife, "Now I know how he feels," and she said, "Who?" I said, "The man on fire." And she said, "What do you mean?" I said, "Well, I could never understand how he could get to that point to do that in front of his children. But now I know." And it was a real defining moment where I got him, because it didn't matter about my kids. It didn't matter about my family or my wife. I wanted it to stop. I'd got to the stage where I wanted out. I just want it. It was constant, and yeah, I wanted it to end. And I've been there. I've been there since. Yeah, tough.
I can hear people listening to this podcast begging me to ask the question now. So, has it stopped for you?
No, we're 4 years on, 4 different medications, lots of other health complications. I was being given medication which was causing side effects, so they give me some medication to treat them side effects, and before I knew it I was on sort of 16 plus tablets a day, and I lost, you'll know this yourself, I lost all the emotion. I was an emotional person, but I had no emotion. I couldn't cry. The amount of times I wanted to cry, I wanted to just let it out, and I couldn't. And I know that was the medication, because it just gives you that.
It's very common, that, isn't it?
Yeah, and I was 4 years on, and I said to my wife, there's got to be something. Life's got to be better. And I made the decision to come off the medication. The medical professionals can't believe that I went cold turkey, and I did it because of, and I did have withdrawals, So I came off the meds. It took about 5 weeks. Not all of the meds, because some of the meds are needed for other health problems. But all of a sudden, I started to get feelings back. I started to get emotion. And I can remember sat on my bed, and one of my daughters came home from school. I was just streaming, and she said, "Are you okay, Dad?" And I said, "I've never been better." Because I had this, I could cry. And I started to feel different, and I was telling everyone, I'm off my meds, I feel amazing, I feel like a new person, and everything was going great. And then I think just reality just dropped back in, I spend a lot of time at home on my own, so you spend a lot of time in your own head. Kids go off to school, wife goes off to work, and it's like, right, okay, what am I going to do with my life now, sort of thing. And the problem I've always had around getting another job, or it's like it comes round in waves, and it's always unexpected. So that whatever the trigger may be, I can be absolutely fine, and then I can wake up tomorrow morning and I don't want to get out of bed. I don't want to shower. I don't want to eat. I don't want to look after myself. So I started to. Now I understand what was happening. I started to slip down the slope again, and then I relapsed with the alcohol, and again self-medicating, because I'm not on any medication. And then we had winter. I'm not great in the winter, and got to crisis point. Community mental health team, etc. Again, put my wife through, and my kids just through torment. People will know that it was me that was diagnosed, with PTSD and depression, etc. But they got it as well. They've suffered. I owe my life to my wife, because she's just kept everything going, and I don't know what to do without her. So it got to that point again where I needed some intervention. So I'm back on the medication, small dosage, and only the once. When I was on the medication previously, there was lots of other, so you didn't know what was working. You didn't know what was helping or what was making things worse. So this time, small dosage, and we'll just see how it goes. And I've started to do a little bit of trying to get myself fit again. I used to love the outdoors. I've done some volunteering, done football coaching, and it's very difficult to keep something going because the big thing is I'm triggered by the job. So my wife works in the job.
You're never away from it then.
It's something that I've had to step away from it, and it's very difficult to explain to old colleagues and good friends that are still in there or have recently retired why I don't want to go for a coffee, or because I'm triggered. And it's really sad because my best friend he's still there, and it's just so difficult to deal with it. Even watching programs, there was a program on Legends. It was undercover. Steve Coogan about the customs. That triggered me, because it was so close to home. So it's learning them triggers, and it's learning then to try and avoid certain things. But I can't avoid the police,
Somebody said something about grief, and that you don't choose the time to grieve. If you've lost a loved one or something, grief chooses the time for you. And that sounds very much the way that's going with being triggered. You can't really put your finger on why. It just happens.
Yeah, it does. It does. And it's always when you're in a good place, things are going well, and then bang, out of nowhere. And it can be something as daft as just some bad news. I might need some new tyres on my car, or the electricity bill's gone up. And what is normal stress for everybody is magnified so much in my head, because it's like the world's ended, and that starts the process of me then going down the slippery slope.
Yes, I don't have PTSD. I think I've got some of the symptoms of PTSD. I hate supermarkets. I hate crowds of people, and I have little to no patience. the slightest thing will not just annoy me, but make me really annoyed.
Road rage?
Yeah. I'm okay on the road because I accept that everybody else is an idiot. So
Yeah.
once you accept that they're idiots, it's easy to deal with. But yeah, those little things. And I never used to be like that. And when I had my breakdown, I remember... Well, I'll give you an example. I fractured my spine last year. I fell off a ladder, my own stupid fault. And I was boarded and taken to A&E at Preston, which is... I've spent many a time there dealing with fatal and serious collisions. So yeah, I knew exactly where I was, looking up at the ceiling, and every single job came flooding back to me, and I ended up in tears. And I thought, where the hell did that come from? You know, it's like, I thought these jobs hadn't affected me.
Yeah.
And all those years later, and some of these jobs were 10
It's not
12 years.
processed.
No.
You've not processed them, have you?
No.
But we didn't know about processing stuff back in the, in them days. Once you retire, that's withdrawn, even though, and I totally understand that. It's about finances at the end of the day, and that feeling of sort of being left on your own. And I waited 2 years for NHS support, and the way I look at, I was a police officer, same as you, and if you'd see someone begging outside the local Tesco Express or whatever, you wouldn't give them money because they're going to go and buy drugs or they're going to go and buy drink, etc. I see the world totally different now, because I knew how I felt, and I had a home, I had a job, and I still felt, so I see mental health totally different now.
That's really interesting you say that. Obviously, earlier on you mentioned about you knew the guy that set himself on fire, you knew how he felt. And that's exactly the thought. Maybe that's why it affected me when I was in A&E, staring up at the ceiling. All these jobs came flooding back, and it was always me that was standing next to that trolley. But now it was me that was in the trolley. A complete role reversal, and maybe that's one of the reasons perhaps that it affected me so much. Where would you say you are now? I'm hoping that you say you're in a better place. You're clearly not there yet.
No, and I think I've come to terms with the fact that I won't be where I'd like to be. I don't think it will leave me. It's about learning to cope and to learn about myself, educate myself, and I've worked really hard. I've done cold water therapy, meditation, you name it, and I'll give anything a go. And I'll also talk. I'll talk to anybody about how I feel, and I think we need to talk more. Certainly, blokes, and if I can help somebody who's suffering like I suffer, then I've done my bit. There's lots of things that I closely monitoring Ibogaine treatments, which they do in Mexico for veterans.
I've not heard of that.
Right, get on Netflix, and there's a documentary on there about Navy SEALs, veterans that suffer with severe PTSD, going to Mexico and doing this. It's a psychedelic treatment done in a hospital, and there's evidence now. Donald Trump's just signed an agreement to say that they'll fund the veterans to go and have this treatment, and it resets your brain in a way. It's obviously early days. It's very expensive, but I'm keeping my eye on it. I'm monitoring it. It always comes over here after it's been in America a few years later. So I don't know. I take a day at a time. It's very difficult. My wife always talks about a routine and having a purpose in life. I think I lost my purpose in life. I've been very lonely, but I can't look too far ahead. So I deal with today and I'll deal with tomorrow, and make sure that my kids and my wife are good, and just keep going.
I think we overcomplicate life. Everybody asks, what is the purpose of life? And the purpose of life is to live. It's as simple as that, really. One of the reasons I do these podcasts is that, you have a very powerful story, and there will be somebody sat at home right now listening to your words, and there is no better feeling or connection knowing that, do you know what, I'm not the only one that's suffering this.
I think when you come into contact with people that have suffered with mental health, you have a totally different conversation than you do with people that haven't suffered and don't quite understand. Very difficult. Some of my friends and colleagues just didn't know what to say to me. Didn't know how to start a conversation. If it was a physical injury, you can see it. So, because a lot of people say, "Oh, I didn't know you suffer. You're always smiling. You're always happy." But that's the mask.
Yes. Finally, then, I suppose, has there been a single moment in your life where you've learned more about yourself than at any other time?
Yeah. So, 2011. So I'd been diagnosed diabetes about 5 years at that point. I went over to Tanzania and I had a crack at Kilimanjaro. We were about 5 days in and I had a little bit of a slip down the side of the mountain. I hadn't tightened a walking pole. I'd put my weight on it and I went for a tumble. Didn't realise at the time, but I damaged a disc in my back. We had a doctor with us, so he was pumping me full of tramadol injections for pain relief. And I probably should have turned back and I should have probably gone back down the mountain when my best friend went down because he was suffering with altitude sickness. But I had this determination. I'd had no phone signal for a week and my wife was pregnant with one of my daughters, so I didn't know whether she'd been born or nothing. And summit night came and I was in agony. And the amount of times I wanted to just stop and just go to sleep. I was exhausted. It was very cold. I just found a little bit of inner strength, I think, where I just thought, no, got to do this. It was for charity as well. And I made it to the top. Still don't know how. I learned a lot on that trip. I knew I had a bit of inner resilience when I need it.
My dog has come into the studio, and so it's not me that's doing the heavy breathing. Well, that's amazing. What an amazing testimony. And I thank you for your time today.
Thank you for inviting me up. It's been a pleasure.
DCT Audio. The art of good listening.